I want you to picture a scene. We're in France. It's the mid-19th century.
A second empire.
Exactly. And on the surface, everything looks great. Industrialization is beaming. There's smoke in the air. The economy seems strong. But underneath all of that, there's a crisis brewing.
And not the kind of crisis you'd expect. Not a war, not a rebellion.
No, this was something much stranger. A literal bubbling crisis. I mean, imagine walking into a brewery. You've got that great smell of hops and grain. But underneath it, there's this sharp, rancid stench.
A sourness.
Yes. That's beer. We're talking thousands and thousands of gallons just turning sour right there in the factories. And it wasn't just beer. Wine was turning to vinegar in the barrel.
Before it could even get to a customer. And you have to understand, for France, this was catastrophic. This was like the oil wells drying up in Texas. It was hitting the French economy right in its heart.
But we're talking about millions of francs just evaporating.
Absolutely. And what made it so terrifying was that nobody knew why. It was a complete mystery. For most people, it was just bad luck. Or maybe an act of God. Some people thought it was bad air, this concept of miasma causing decay.
An invisible, unstoppable enemy.
Exactly.
And that right there is the hook for today's deep dive. We are unpacking the story of the man who was called in to solve that very mystery.
Yeah.
We're looking at the life and the work of Louis Pasteur.
Right.
But this isn't going to be a standard biography, born here, died there. We want to look at how basically a consulting gig for a panicked brewery.
A desperate brewery.
A desperate brewery, yeah. How that job ended up disproving one of the biggest scientific fallacies of the age and really inventing modern medicine as we know it.
It's a true detective story. The villain is invisible, the stakes are national, and the hero is. Well, he's not the person you'd expect.
That's the perfect place to start. So let's dive in, because when we think of these huge scientific names, your Newtons, your Einsteins, there's this image that comes to mind.
The lone genius.
The genius. Exactly. The person who was just born different. And I think a lot of people have that statue in their head of Louis Pasteur, the man with a microscope in one hand and a formula in the other from day one. But looking at the sources we have, that's not the story at all, is it?
Not even close. In fact, it's almost the opposite. If you go back to his early life, he was born in Dole, France in 1822. And there's very little there to suggest future global icon.
He came from a pretty modest background, right?
Very modest. His father was a tanner, a working-class family, no special privileges, no private tutors, none of that. And in school, he was average.
I found this one note just fascinating. In his early academic records, he was actually rated as mediocre in chemistry.
Mediocre? Can you imagine that?
The man who would go on to basically define 19th century chemistry was considered just okay at it.
It's such a great reminder that, what you do in school doesn't always predict your impact. And honestly, his real passion, his talent early on, wasn't even science.
It was art.
It was art. He was a very talented pastel painter. He did these incredible portraits of his parents, of his neighbors. He had a fantastic eye for detail, for texture, for the little things.
Which, when you think about it, kind of foreshadows his scientific method, doesn't it? That ability to observe closely, to see the things that other people miss.
That's a great point. It's all about observation.
So if he wasn't this natural-born prodigy, if he wasn't, scribbling equations in the margins of his books, what was his superpower? What was the engine that drove him?
It wasn't raw talent in the way we think of it. It was character. The sources all point to this immense, almost obsessive discipline. He was a grinder. He was patient.
He just works harder than everyone else.
He worked harder, and he was obsessed with one thing above all else: proof. When he eventually got into the École Normale Supérieure, which was the elite training ground for French academics.
The best of the best.
Right. That's where he sharpened this obsession. He developed this absolute fixation on proving things experimentally.
Let's pause on that word proof for a second. Because today, we just take the scientific method for granted. You have a hypothesis, you design an experiment, you test it, you publish the results. But in the mid-1800s, science was still a bit more philosophical.
That's a very polite way of putting it. It was. There was a lot of theorizing, a lot of grand arguments based on logic or, what Aristotle said centuries ago. People would debate things with, it stands to reason that.
Not my experiment shows that.
Exactly. But Pasteur didn't care what stood to reason. He didn't care about philosophy. He cared about what he could demonstrate right there in a flask on a lab bench. He was described as having a fearless way of thinking. He had no problem telling the entire scientific establishment they were wrong as long as he had the data.
And he was going to need that fearlessness because the problem they brought to him, this beer crisis, It was an absolute nightmare.
It was.
So let's go back to that. We called it a national industrial disaster earlier, but I want to really get a sense of the scale. How bad was it?
It was an economic catastrophe. You have to remember, in France, wine and beer aren't just beverages. They are a massive part of the GDP. They're a cultural export. It's a point of national pride.
And suddenly it's going bad.
Suddenly, production runs are failing at incredible rates. We're talking 30, 40, sometimes 50% of a batch just gone, spoiled.
That's completely unsustainable. That's like if an auto manufacturer built 100 cars and 50 of them just wouldn't start when they rolled off the line.
Precisely. Businesses were collapsing, vintners, brewers, they were absolutely desperate and furious. They had tried everything they could think of.
What kind of things?
Oh, everything. Changing the type of wood for the barrels, changing the temperature in the cellar. Some were probably praying over the vats. They blamed the weather, the water source, anything, but nothing worked consistently.
So they were just throwing darts in the dark.
Completely. So eventually, the government under Napoleon III basically taps Pasteur on the shoulder and says, look, you're one of our top chemists. You need to figure this out. Fix our beer.
It's such an interesting career pivot for him because at the time, he was an academic, right? He was studying the structure of crystals, very theoretical stuff.
Yes, his early work was on molecular asymmetry, deeply theoretical chemistry. And suddenly, he's being asked to do industrial troubleshooting.
And that context is so important. He wasn't setting out to cure disease. He wasn't on a quest to save humanity. Not yet, anyway.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He was on a quest to save a beverage. The question they gave him was simple and direct. Why is our liquid spoiling? It was a practical economic problem that needed a practical economic solution.
So he gets the call. He packs his bags. He goes to the breweries. He smells the sour beer.
Yeah.
What does he do that's so different? I mean, brewers have been looking at beer for centuries. They knew every step of the process. What did Pasteur see that they all missed?
He looked closer, much, much closer. He stopped looking at the beer as just a chemical soup and started looking at it as a living habitat.
With his microscope.
With his microscope. He took samples of the good beer, the healthy stuff that tasted great, and he put it under the lens. Then he took samples of the sour, spoiled beer and did the same.
And at this point, a microscope is not standard equipment in a brewery, is it?
Oh, absolutely not. This was high-tech laboratory stuff for the time. It would be like bringing a DNA sequencer into a cheese shop today. It was just not part of that world.
Okay, so what does he see? What's in the good beer?
In the good beer, he sees these little round globule-like shapes. They were consistent. They were everywhere. That was the yeast.
And people knew about yeast, right?
They knew yeast was involved in fermentation, but they thought of it more as a chemical agent, a catalyst. Pasteur was one of the first to really argue convincingly that yeast was a living organism.
So that's, aha, moment number one. Fermentation isn't just a chemical reaction, it's a biological process. It's alive.
Correct. The yeast is a living thing. It eats the sugar in the grain mash, and as a waste product, it excretes alcohol and carbon dioxide.
That's what makes beer. Beer. It's an act of consumption and waste by a living microbe.
Exactly. But, and this is the big twist, when he looked at the sour beer, the yeast was still there. He could see the little globules. But mixed in with them was something else.
Something new.
Something new. These other shapes, they were much smaller and they were rod-shaped. They looked like tiny little sticks floating around.
The invaders.
The invaders, the bacteria. And he realized that while the yeast was busy producing alcohol, these little rods were doing something else entirely. They were producing lactic acid.
Lactic acid. That's the stuff that makes milk go sour,
Yes.
right? It gives you that tangy, spoiled taste.
Precisely that. So what you had, essentially, was a war going on inside the vat of beer. You had two different microorganisms competing for the same food source. The yeast wants to make delicious alcohol. The bacteria wants to make sour acid.
And if the bacteria win that war...
Your beer tastes like salad dressing. It's ruined.
Okay, I just want to stop and clarify something here because this is the pivotal moment. To us, this sounds almost obvious. Oh, there's bacteria in the beer. We learned that in middle school. But at that time, did people even really know what bacteria were?
That's the crucial question. They knew tiny things existed. Van Leeuwenhoek had seen animalcules, these little animals, with his lenses back in the 1600s. But nobody thought they did anything important.
They were just a curiosity.
A curiosity, exactly. Or, and this was the dominant theory, they were the result of the spoilage, not the cause. The thinking was, oh, the beer went bad, and because it went bad, these little bugs just sort of appeared.
Spontaneously generated from the spoiled liquid. We'll get to that later.
Exactly. But Pasteur, he flipped the causality completely. He said, no, you have it backward. The beer didn't just go bad and then bugs appeared. These bugs got in and they made it go bad.
That is a massive, massive paradigm shift. You're saying the problem isn't the wood in the barrel. It's not the temperature. It's not the phase of the moon. The problem is an invisible army of living creatures actively attacking your product.
Yes. And the terrifying implication of that is that something invisible was alive, and it could destroy an entire industry. But the hopeful side of it is this. If the problem is a living organism,
You can kill it.
you can kill it.
And that brings us to the solution. The invention that, still carries his name to this day, pasteurization. Now, I have to admit, until I was reading for this, I always assumed pasteurization just meant boiling something to death, just nuking it with heat.
That is a really common misconception, and it's what a lot of people probably would have tried. But if you do that to wine or beer, you completely ruin it.
Why?
Well, you cook off the alcohol, for one, and you destroy all the delicate, volatile, aromatic compounds that give it its flavor and its smell. If Pasteur had told the great French winemakers to boil their vintage Bordeaux
They would have laughed him out of the room.
or run him out of town with pitchforks, he knew he had to find a middle ground, a Goldilocks zone for the heat.
Hot enough to kill the bad guys, but cool enough to save the taste.
Perfectly put. So he experimented relentlessly with different temperatures, different timings, and he discovered you didn't need to get anywhere near boiling point, which is 100 degrees Celsius.
So what was the magic number?
He found that if you gently heat the liquid to around 55 to 60 degrees Celsius, that's about 130 to 140 Fahrenheit, and hold it there for just a short period,
The bacteria die.
the bacteria die. Those little rod-shaped lactic acid producers were much more sensitive to heat than the yeast was, and certainly more sensitive than the liquid itself. It was enough to kill the invaders without destroying the product.
It's so elegant. It's such a simple, practical, gentle solution.
It's beautiful, isn't it? And it worked brilliantly. Almost overnight, once the breweries and wineries started implementing this process, this gentle heating, the spoilage problem just stopped.
The economic bleeding was over.
The industry was saved. He'd done it.
And the connection to our world today is it's undeniable. Every single time I open my fridge and I see a carton of milk or a bottle of juice or even some cheeses, I'm literally looking at Pasteur's legacy.
100%. That method, pasteurization, is the fundamental reason we can have a safe, global food distribution system. It's the reason you can drink milk without a serious risk of getting tuberculosis or brucellosis or any number of other nasty infections that were common back then.
It's incredible. It started with beer, but it ended up protecting basically the entire food supply.
It did.
So on one level, this is an incredible success story. He's a national hero. He's saved a vital industry. But the source material we have takes a really sharp and very sad turn right around this time. Because while he's having this massive professional success, being celebrated by brewers and politicians, his personal life was it was falling apart.
This is the part of the story that really humanizes him for me. It's so easy to see the scientist in the lab coat, the icon. It's much harder to see the father, the man going through this. And the transition in his life during this period was just brutal.
We're talking about the tragedy with his children.
Yes. Between 1859 and 1865, so right in the middle of all this groundbreaking work on fermentation and pasteurization, Louis Pasteur lost 3 of his 5 children.
3.
3 of his daughters. Jean died first from typhoid at age 9, then a few years later, Cécile at age 12, and then the very next year, Camille, who was only 2, all to infectious diseases.
In the span of 6 years, I can't even imagine that kind of grief.
It's unimaginable today. But we have to put it in the context of the era. This was normal. This was the mid-19th century, the age of uncontrolled infectious disease.
Doctors were basically helpless.
They were. They could give you a name for what you had. They might try bleeding you with leeches to balance your humors, but they could not stop an infection once it really took hold. And that applied to everyone. Even if you were the smartest scientist in France, you were powerless. You just had to stand by and watch your children die.
And that grief, that powerlessness,
Yeah.
it must have been devastating. But the sources suggest it didn't break him. Or maybe it's better to say it broke him in a way that that rebuilt him with a completely new purpose.
It absolutely changed his motivation. It refocused his entire life's work. You know, up until this point, he's fixing beer and wine. He's saving an economy. That's important, noble work.
Of course.
But after losing his daughters, it wasn't about saving an industry anymore. It was about saving lives. The stakes became personal. They became existential.
So you can almost see the shift in the questions he's asking. The beer experiment gave him the how, right? The mechanics of how microbes work. But the death of his children gave him the why.
That's a perfect way to put it. The notes in his journal suggest a profound change. He's no longer just an industrial chemist for hire. He becomes a man on a mission. He starts connecting the dots in a new way. He realizes, wait a minute.
If a microscopic invader can get into a vat of beer and make it sick,
Then can a microscopic invader get into a human body and make it sick?
the germ theory of disease.
The very foundation of it. He starts to see the human body as a vessel, just like that wine barrel. And if you can figure out how to keep the microbial invaders out, the vessel stays healthy. But to prove that, to convince the medical world, he had to take on the biggest, oldest, most entrenched belief in all of biology.
The final boss fight.
The final boss, for sure.
And this is the great battle against spontaneous generation.
The Great Debate. It's one of my absolute favorite episodes in the history of science because it was a real clash of worldviews. It was the old world against the new.
Okay, so for anyone listening who might not be up on their 19th century scientific feuds,
Yeah.
let's unpack this idea. Spontaneous generation.
Yes.
It sounds like a magic trick.
It essentially was magical thinking, but it was dressed up in the language of science. The prevailing belief, and this was taught in the best universities, believed by the smartest people, was that life could just appear from non-living matter.
So if you leave a piece of meat out on the counter and maggots appear a few days later.
The belief was that the decaying meat itself created the maggots, not that flies laid eggs on it, or if you left broth out and it got cloudy with bacteria, they believed the broth generated that life from within itself.
So life from nothing.
Life from nothing. It's a very old idea. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. It was tied to this philosophy of vitalism. They believed there was a vital force or a life principle in the air, and this force could spontaneously organize dead matter into living things.
And Pasteur, having just proven that microbes cause decay, not the other way around, looks at this and says,
No, that's impossible. It makes no sense. He was convinced that life only comes from pre-existing life. Omne vivum ex vivo. A microbe has to have a parent microbe.
but remember his superpower. He can't just say they're wrong.
He can't just argue. He has to prove it. And his opponents, they were very clever and very loud. They had a counter-argument ready. They said, Pasteur, the reason your boiled flasks of broth stay sterile is because by boiling it, you destroyed the vital force in the air inside the flask. You suffocated its life-giving potential. You need fresh air for spontaneous generation to work.
So it's a classic catch-22. To sterilize the experiment, he has to do something that his opponents can claim invalidates the experiment.
Precisely. So he had to design an experiment that did two things at once. It had to let the fresh air in to satisfy his critics, but it also had to keep the microbes out to prove his own point.
And that leads him to what might be the most elegant and famous experiment in all of biology.
The swan neck flask experiment. It is such a beautiful piece of scientific design because it uses incredibly simple physics to prove a profoundly complex biological point.
So paint the picture for us. What does this thing actually look like?
Okay, so imagine a standard round glass flask, the kind you'd see in any chemistry lab. And inside, he puts a nutrient broth, basically a soup that bacteria love to eat.
Bacteria food.
Exactly. But the neck of the flask isn't short and straight. He takes a flame, heats the glass neck until it's soft, and then he carefully pulls and bends it, stretching it out into a long, thin tube that curves down, runs horizontally for a bit, and then curves back up.
So it looks like the neck of a swan.
It looks exactly like the neck of a swan, and this is the crucial part. The end of that long, curved neck is completely open to the air.
Okay, so that's key. He's letting the air in. He's silencing the critics who said he was cutting off the vital force.
He's playing by their rules. So he takes this flask, he boils the broth inside it to kill any microbes that were already there, making it sterile. Then he just lets it sit on the shelf, and he waits.
And what happens?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The broth stays perfectly clear. It stays sterile for days, for weeks, for years, in fact.
Wait, years.
Oh, yeah. Some of his original flasks from the 1860s are still on display at the Pasteur Institute in Paris today, and the broth inside is still sterile over 150 years later.
That's amazing. But hold on. If the air And this supposed vital force is getting into the flask. Why is there no life? Why no spontaneous generation?
Gravity. That is the genius of the design. Think about it. Dust particles, bacteria, fungal spores, they're all floating in the air, but they have mass. They're tiny, but they're not weightless.
Okay.
So when the air flows into the open end of the swan neck, it has to travel down that first curve, and as it does, any particles of dust and microbes settle out at the bottom of the bend. They get trapped in the U-bend by gravity.
It's a dust trap, like
Well,
the U-bend under a sink.
It's a perfect analogy. It's a gravity filter.
Right.
So the vital force of the air could get in, but its passengers, the actual physical microbes, got stuck in the waiting room. They couldn't make the journey up the next slope against gravity to reach the broth.
So the air gets sterilized just by passing through the tube.
Exactly. And just to put the final nail in the coffin, he did a second step. He took one of those perfectly clear, sterile flasks that had been sitting for months.
There you go.
He simply tipped it, just enough so that some of the sterile broth sloshed down into the curved neck, touched the dust and microbes that had collected in the trap, and then washed back into the main body of the flask.
And then what happened?
Within hours, the broth was cloudy, teeming with bacteria. It stank. It was completely contaminated.
That is the mic drop. That is irrefutable.
It was the definitive proof. It's one of the most important experiments in scientific history. He proved, beyond any doubt, that the air itself doesn't create life. The particles carried in the air create life. If you filter out those particles, you stop the contamination. He broke the chain of superstition that went back thousands of years.
And the implications of that are just staggering. Because if infection isn't some magical force, if it's a physical thing, a particle that can be carried on dust or on your hands,
And you can stop it.
you can control it.
Exactly. This is the bedrock of all modern medicine. It's the reason sterilization works. It's the reason quarantine works. It's the reason that when a surgeon washes their hands before an operation, they aren't just being polite. They are physically removing the agents of death from their skin.
It validates the work of people like Joseph Lister in surgery with his antiseptics.
It does. Lister actually gave Pasteur explicit credit. He basically said, I'm just applying Monsieur Pasteur's principles to surgery. Before this, you had surgeons who wore their blood-stiffened aprons almost as a badge of honor. They wouldn't wash their instruments between patients.
Because they didn't see the point.
They didn't see the point. After Pasteur's work, they realized they were walking, talking biohazards. It changed everything.
So when you stack it all up,
Mm.
understanding fermentation, inventing pasteurization, disproving spontaneous generation, and laying the groundwork for germ theory, it's just an overwhelming list of accomplishments.
It's a massive, massive legacy. He fundamentally changed how human beings interact with the biological world around them. You know, before Pasteur, we were essentially victims of an invisible, chaotic world where disease and decay could just manifest out of nowhere. After Pasteur, we understood the rules of the game for the first time.
And that's why he gets that title, the father of modern microbiology.
He absolutely earned it because he didn't just make one discovery. He built the entire foundation for the field. He gave us the rule book. He shifted the reality of medicine by proving that we share this planet with trillions of invisible creatures and that those creatures can control life and death.
And, crucially, that we can control them if we're smart about it, if we understand them.
Yes, knowledge is power. His work was the ultimate proof of that.
So we've traced this incredible arc from a boy in Dole, France, who wasn't a prodigy, just a meticulous hard worker.
An artist, really.
An artist, right. To the man who saved the French beer and wine industry. Then to the grieving father who channeled that unimaginable pain into a war on disease. And finally, to the scientist who, with a simple piece of glassware, proved that life doesn't just pop out of thin air. It's an incredible story.
It really is, and it's one of those stories where the personality of the scientist was just as important as the science itself. If he hadn't been so stubborn, so obsessed with proof, and so willing to challenge authority, he might have just accepted the bad air theory and moved on with his life.
I want to leave our listeners with a final thought on this. We live in a world where we take things like food safety and sterile hospitals and antibiotics and vaccines almost completely for granted. But there was a moment in time, not that long ago, where none of that existed. And the world was a much scarier, much more mysterious place.
And it took someone with the patience and the discipline to look at the spoiled liquid, to look at the ugly, messy, decaying parts of life, and just keep asking why, without ever settling for the easy, magical answer.
That insistence on proof over philosophy is the reason we aren't still blaming our fevers on bad smells in the air.
It's the reason we have a fighting chance against our invisible enemies. And I think that's the ultimate lesson of his life. Don't just accept the mystery, find the mechanism.
That is a perfect place to leave it. Next time you pour yourself a glass of wine or check the expiration date on your milk, maybe take a second to tip your hat to the mediocre chemistry student from Dole who ended up changing the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the microscopic world.
It's always a pleasure to connect the dots.
We'll see you on the next deep dive. Keep asking questions.